So this lecture probes into more detail of how approaches from liberal theory really explain how conflict emerges and how conflict can be settled and resolved. So really, how did we invent peace? We have different facets of conflict. Traditional perception, we're competing for resources, we're competing for interests, we want something, the value differences, communism, capitalism, and then dissatisfaction with basic needs. Now, again, if you perceive that some particular resource is scarce, that certainly worsens competitive situations. But we have a strong desire to have access to that particular limited resource. Level of competition affected by availability and value of territories or resources. So again, territories or resources that more than one party claims as theirs or values highly certainly will lead to conflict. And then power struggle, if one group tries to impose their own language, religious or social values on other groups. That happens particularly within states, multi-ethnic frameworks in particular. Now, if goals are incompatible, that could either lead to compromise or sustain conflict. In 1999, East Timor wanted to have a popular referendum for independence that was crushed by the Indonesian military. Like in Macedonia, and in the late 90s, 2000s, we had some revolts by ethnic Albanians who were unhappy with the status quo, and then negotiations led to increased representation, more ethnic language teaching at schools and colleges, which then really met the needs and desires of ethnic Albanians. And then if you look at beneath the struggle for territory, resource, and wealth, pride, we're looking at variables like pride, identity, and security. So if you're any given conflict, each group has a sense of security and loyalty to your group. As you become more build up your group solidarity, certainly you become more antagonized towards the other party. So that leads to greater rigidity, greater polarization between the groups. Build up of solidarity is almost goes hand in hand with developing more antagonistic attitudes towards the other party. Whether that enemy is real or perceived, that doesn't matter. We're looking at an insulicization of negative interactions in protected social conflicts. Looking at Sudan, Israel, Palestine, of course, would be a prime example that this perception of enmity or the enmity itself and hostility really has been handed down from generation to generation. That affects the communities, that affects both nations, not only the current generation, but it goes back and is likely to affect future generations. And then also, conflict preoccupies political, intellectual agendas, educational systems, are being used to support or justify certain values or ideologies. Looking at the orange order marches in Northern Ireland, the display of the orange color, reference to the Catholic King of Holland back in the Middle Ages, really is meant to show the group solidarity, group cohesion of Catholics, but certainly is seen as a direct affront to Republican Irish citizens in Northern Ireland. So these marches, colors, symbols have a big significance in conflict and can either fuel conflict or, if done properly, can actually lead to a reduction of hostilities. Now, psychology of conflict is important. That if imagine you are in a situation where you are subject to forms of victimization, forms of violence. Just think about African Americans during the time of the segregation. So that physical and psychological endurance is needed in order to live with it, in order to overcome that continuous either prosecution or trauma. So you're looking at coping with loss of life, livelihood, deaths of community members, injustice, subjugation. So you're constantly subject to these forms of violence. Now, again, you can see that as you subject to different forms of hardship, you starting again to strengthen your social identity within your own group, so that it strengthens internal bonds, increases in cognitive closures among the group, and increases in-group attachment. You can see that how again leads to a persistence of conflict. So psychology of conflict is very, very important. So we're not only looking at the trauma individuals are subject to, but that again how that in turn affects group cohesion and in-group loyalty, as well as in-group solidarity over time. Now, we have two forms of how to end conflict: conflict settlement versus conflict resolution. Now, conflict settlement, the idea is that there's a collaborative search for strategies to put an end to conflict. So you're looking at in a joint venture to analyze interests, needs underneath divisive issues, and a commitment to a new social political system, free elections, protection of opposition, power sharing, land reform. That one particular group which was excluded from government, that had been subject to forms of hardship, persecution, they are receiving, they're being enfranchised. They are actually making sure that their voices are being heard again. So this is a collaborative search for solutions. Now, looking at the settlements in civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador would be an example of conflict settlement. Conflict resolution, on the other hand, is very different. It looks at compromises without a satisfactory removal of deeply entrenched contentious issues. So there's no real examination of underlying sources of grievances. We're looking at a termination of violence, but the main focus is on achieving a compromise solution and diffusing an imminent crisis. Looking at Kenya, we always have these post-election violence. They will persist as long as intertribal rivalry persists, and that itself is really a symptom of the failure to reduce inequity within the economy. Sudan, we have unresolved issues of oil resources. Western Sahara and Morocco is still an issue of sovereignty and perceived occupation. And then Armenia and Azerbaijan, we still have conflict between those two countries. So again, that shows you settlement versus conflict resolution. Now, what are the patterns of armed conflict? Now, again, if you're looking at Europe, there was very little conflict during the Cold War because of the two superpowers. And that certainly has risen sharply after the breakup of the Soviet Union. We had, two armed conflicts in '89 and then 10 in 1993. And the Balkan War, of course, was a particularly destructive civil war with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Again, Africa in the mid-1990s, they appeared to be the chief beneficiary of the end of the Cold War. We had a lot of proxy wars in Africa throughout the Cold War. So we had 14 wars in '89, then 17 in '99, 9 in '95, 14 in '98. Horn of Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia continues to be troublesome, and then we had the resource-rich region of Central Africa, which continues to experience conflict. Middle East, we really have now a situation of permanent conflict, which was exacerbated by the 2003 Iraq invasion of the United States. We really had over a decade of violence, and then come Syria 2012, the fallout of the Arab Spring, a civil war in Syria that led to further disintegration of Syria, partly also Iraq, the rise of ISIS. So right now, almost every country in the Middle East is somehow involved in interstate war. South America, reduction of conflicts from the 1980s was quite significant, except for Colombia. But we've seen, again, with the end of the Cold War, we see a relative peace in South America. Now, again, if you're looking at, and it's easy to forget that, if you're looking at the current state of conflict in the world, the current state of affairs in international relations, we are actually living in a much better time and a much more peaceful time than 60 years ago. So if you're looking at, it's 1940 civil war in China, we're looking at 1 million deaths. Vietnam War, 2 million deaths. Afghan War in the 80s, 1.2 million deaths. Nigerian civil war, we're looking at over 1 million deaths. So again, even though we might like to think that it's quite depressing how things are, we are actually much better off today than we were 60 years ago, 30 years ago. Now, if you're looking at, this is the Uppsala conflict data set. Uppsala is a university in Sweden, and they're looking at, quantitative analysis of all forms of conflict. And this one in particular looks at how conflict ends. So you're looking at the status of the end of the fighting, victory, a peace agreement, or a ceasefire. And then you see the total number of termination, how many of them are being renewed within 10 years, and then renewed in the full period. Now, you see that termination by either victory or peace agreement are the most effective means of ending violence, but have different time perspectives. So peace agreements that survive the first years may last longer than termination by victory. And then victories are more likely to be challenged after a longer period of time than peace agreement. Now, why is that? Well, if one side wins, that means that the other side will have lost. They either gave up or they no longer had enough military equipment to continue the fighting. That means if a victory ended a particular conflict, that will be more likely to be challenged after a longer period of time after that particular group can regroup and again resort to a new violence. So again, they need time to again challenge the victorious power. Now, bottom line is that many conflicts are deeply entrenched. We have broken negotiations, ceasefires, abandoned peace agreements, and a lot of conflicts are becoming increasingly difficult to settle. Just look at Afghanistan. The Afghan war back then, the war began by Communist Party to reform a very feudal society. That led to a complex civil war and then led to the entry of the Soviet Union in 1980 in the Afghan war. Now, how do we solve these intractable conflicts? In fact, if you go back to the First World War, this is a rather fascinating story. You can pick up the book. It's called Live and Let Live System. And it looks at how peace actually broke out between different factions of the British, the German, and French armies in the trenches in the First World War. This was, spontaneous rise of non-aggressive cooperative behavior that started really with the Christmas truce in 1914, and then it led to what now appears curious, soccer matches between the English and the Germans in no man's land. Now, how did that happen? Now, the Live and Let Live system, that particular book, it really is game theory, that if you were the English or the Germans, you really had the same sort of capabilities. You were able to use your machine guns, artillery, and you might be able to gain a few more meters. But then again, you had a counter-offensive by your opponent, and you had to retreat. So it really was, static warfare, trench warfare. Both parties relatively had the same capabilities. Now, you could decide to kill, or in fact, you could decide not to use violence and reciprocate an offer of a truce by the other party. So it really was truly a game theory type situation, because both parties had the same capabilities and as such had the same choices of how to respond. Now again, we had a few more truces, but then the military command in Britain and Germany got hold of the story, and they threatened with court-martials of any officers who would engage in these unauthorized truces. But these sort of the trench warfare, there was a true game theory type power of reciprocity. And we mentioned it before, looking at the taunt between the Soviets and the Americans, the tit-for-tat computer game we mentioned before in the other lecture. The reciprocity is the ultimate dynamic. The iterated prisoner's dilemma is the ultimate dynamic of how we explain conflict resolution techniques. Now, focusing on basic needs. If you're looking at different forms of conflict, Kosa talked about realistic conflicts. Edward Assar talked about protected social conflicts. Conflicts here arise from frustration of specific demands and are directed at the presumed frustrating object. There's an unwillingness to continue accepting indignity and frustration without fighting back. So violence is a means of communication. Violence back in LA, the so-called race riots in the 60s, really was a means of communication at what African Americans at the time considered no longer tolerable. And so these riots were seen as a means of political communication. So if basis of conflict is denial of particular needs, then conflict resolution process must identify them and include ways to answer them. Relative deprivation is the key here. Relative deprivation means that one particular group is being deprived relative to another. So people don't just resort to violence because they're poor or they're disenfranchised, but they're poor or disenfranchised relative to another group. So again, these particular conflicts become quite vicious and very destructive because they're initially seen as a zero-sum type. You have something, we don't have that, we don't have it. In fact, you are taking it away from us. You are in that position because you are excluding us, because you're causing hardship to our group. Now again, in the 60s also, conflict resolution really came of age. So-called problem-solving workshop technique were introduced. The first one was to end the confrontasi, which was Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, really in the process of decolonization. And it was the first time that negotiations tried to go beyond positions and address needs. It certainly was a very symmetric approach. By itself can't lead to a solution, but it can set the agenda to inform other parties on the needs of the other side. So both come forward, and as you start to look beneath positions, you look at preferences, you look at interests, you can actually form a sort of agenda of how to solve that particular conflict. So what are sort of the settlement and resolution procedures available? Now, of course, negotiation is the classic. You probe to unearth underlying concerns, and negotiators share their views in order to establish a common ground. It's supposed to be a fair and efficient outcome that can emerge from the exchange of concessions in a search for a creative solution. So again, we're looking at two parties who have the same sort of assets available to them. The SALT and the START talks between the Soviets and the Americans, again, a prime example that both of them were increasingly uneasy about the arms race spiraling out of control. So both engaged in this sort of confidence building measure. Now, how does a successful negotiation look like? Persuasion as means of social influence to change adversaries' perception. Settlement based on recognition of legitimacy of each other's claims. So again, you have to actually accept the other party as a legitimate counterpart. If you don't even consider them legitimate, you won't even negotiate. And that, of course, is important too. If you're looking at different terrorist groups who came out of the cold and started negotiating and started to become a proper political party, that itself was important, gaining legitimacy in the political process. Threats can be used even in friend relationships. Sometimes you say you threaten, but like, well, we'll walk away and we'll blame you for making those talks fail. And then the shared framing of issues. What's the process? Pre-negotiation, planning and fact-finding, agreeing on a formula. How are we defining the formula? How are we subjecting ourselves to that particular formula? Information sharing, clarification of issues, exchange of concessions, identification of common interest, and exploration of mutual gains. Examining all possible alternatives, choosing best possible and mutually agreeable option, and then negotiators have to check credibility and acceptability with officials in higher in authority. So again, you negotiate between your counterpart, then you go back home and see whether you can actually deliver, whether you have the authority to do that, and whether your people back home will agree to that particular deal you just struck, and then closing the deal. Now again, pre-negotiations. Looking at that photo, talks between the Americans and the North Koreans, in Korean War, almost never took place because of one simple issue, that the North Korean officer was smaller than the Americans, and they had to put a stool there so that they had the same height. That was important for the North Koreans to save face. Had it not happened for that particular, photo op, negotiations would have been very, very difficult to start in the first place. So again, creating a comfortable climate. What's on and what's off the table. What's being discussed. What is even absolutely non-negotiable. Saddam Hussein, when he invaded Kuwait, he said, well, when he realized that people were actually coming to the rescue of Kuwait, he tried to negotiate certain changes to the territory of Iraq. And the Americans and the rest of the permanent members of the UN Security Council said, absolutely not, that is off the table. You have to move out of Kuwait, or we will liberate Kuwait by force. So that was off the table. That's important. Procedural matters, venue, time, and format, who is part of it, and what sort of decision-making structure are you employing. Formal bargaining. So I mentioned a formula. A formula is looking at land for peace in Israel-Palestine. Israel will accept Palestinian sovereign statehood. In exchange, Palestinians will have a peace treaty with the Israelis. This was the formula which really back then Secretary of State Schultz under Reagan came up with, and to this day continues to really direct what now is largely a defunct peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians. But that was important. Both parties agreed to land for peace formula. Peace with Israel in exchange for land for Palestine. Freeze for freeze with the Iran nuclear talks. We will freeze sanctions if you freeze enriching uranium. That was the formula, and then we can negotiate all of the details. And then testing trading possibilities between opposing positions. So again, exchange of proposals moves along with demands, offers, bids, compromises, concessions. Looking at six-party talks in Beijing, negotiations stalled and never took place back in 2008 because they failed to come up with an agenda in the first place. So again, it's a very, very delicate, very, very sticky process. We have two different bargaining styles: principal negotiations and positional bargaining. Positional bargaining is really when you go to the dealership and you see the car dealership as the enemy. They want the best price for themselves, so you want the best price for your car. In business, negotiations, it's very, very a prominent place. It's you versus me approach, high initial demand. You give away very little information regarding what your own facts are, what your own preferences are, and then you throughout you give very few and small concessions combined always with threats. Principled negotiations looks at what we now so earlier said about conflict settlement. You separate people from the problem being negotiated. Sometimes, in particular, in very, very destructive conflicts, if you continue to look at the leadership of that particular group, which caused so much hardship to yours, it's difficult really to sit down with that person. So again, you need to separate the people from the problem. Issues should be decided on their merits rather than being influenced by emotions by the individuals who are involved. And that, of course, is a very, very difficult process. Again, coming back to the psychology of victimization, overcoming that is very, very difficult. Focusing on the negotiators' parties' interests, not their positions. So again, you look at the interests, you don't look at the positions. If you just stick with positions yourself and that other person, it's unlikely you won't go anywhere. Generate different options for mutual gain, and then base the outcome from a principled negotiation session on objective criteria, scientific findings, professional standards, legal precedent. So again, technical issues, you might ask the United Nations and other international organizations to provide some standards which will help you guide that particular issue, particularly when you're looking at carving up territory. You need a third party helping you with that. Of course, there were a lot of barriers to principled negotiations. Rapid decline in public trust, deadlock due to one side adopting a take it or leave it approach. You go into blaming mode. You blame the other party. Cognitive impasse. Cognitive impasse is important. It's difficult. You fail to change your perception. You really, really dislike that particular group, that particular leader. It's so difficult for you to come over that particular impasse. Power imbalances. If one party is in a more powerful position and continues to abuse that, draw on these assets. Contest of will, manipulation tactics, and face saving. To save your face is important in diplomacy as is in high school. You don't want to lose face, and quite often, in order to protect your image, it really makes it difficult to come up with concessions. Looking at back in 1999-2002, Colombian president negotiated with the FARC. The FARC demanded for the government to rein in parliament paramilitary activities, which the government did not do, so negotiations ultimately failed, despite both parties initially entering it in good faith. So what are effective negotiations? Bargaining, reaching a mutually acceptable outcome, not being determined by domination of one group against the other. Negotiation is both situational and relational. So again, good communication is needed, but of course we have different forms of power relationships between parties. Framing and active listening is key for successful exchange of information. Problem solving, finding innovative solutions by bridging and linkage of different interests. and mutual interests can be satisfied by trade-offs of priorities in different issue areas, but have similar levels of significance to either party. So we can be looking at either integrative bargaining or principled negotiations. That these are offering strategies for the greatest payoffs in mixed motive settings in which cooperation produces bigger gains for every bargaining than positional bargaining. So it really is a non-zero sum framework. Now, mediation is important, in particular if the third party is acceptable to all the disputants, to facilitate communication. That is, we have different forms of mediator, open contact, carrying messages, clarifying meanings. It could be very procedural or offering different forms of compromises. Quite often you need a third party. Looking at South Korean humanitarian aid workers were taken hostage in Afghanistan. South Korean government had absolutely no access. So the Saudis and Indonesian mediators actually got involved and managed to get them out. Happens all the time between Israel and Hezbollah, that the German intelligence service is being used as a third party because it's being trusted by both the Lebanese and by the Israelis. Mutually hurting stalemate makes it ripe for mediation as much as ripe for negotiation. So both parties realize they can no longer dominate the other group. Both parties realize they can't win. So either mediation or negotiation is seen as the only option for what is called a mutually hurting stalemate. And we have different, usually the UN Secretary General is seen as a trustworthy party to that end. This is an example of a power-based mediation. NATO continued to bomb Serbian forces in former Yugoslavia during the civil war there, and the mediators, different European and American officials, continued to provide the Serbs with different proposals. Now, as NATO kept bombing and moving against Serbian interest, the Serbs realized that they were losing more and more territory. So you're looking at the very big, very top to the very end, as that future territory of a future Serbia was shrinking, they realized that they actually had to engage in mediation, and then the Dayton Accords was eventually signed in Paris officially in 1995. So again, mediators were European American officials, and they were backed by NATO power. So that is power-based mediation. Now again, and lastly, we're looking at reconciliation. You need to overcome marginalization, alienation, other psychological and social effects of violent conflict. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do. That you, again, after violent conflict, you need to, again, accept the mutual humanity of your opponent. Different forms are being employed in order to do that. In particular, we're looking at post-conflict justice is one thing, that you have blanket amnesty or you have transitional justice. Blanket amnesty, of course, has a lot of problems. Looking at Guatemala, where blanket amnesty was used in order to overcome the conflict, and as more graves are being exhumed, the peace process itself, agreement, is being jeopardized. Transnational justice, that usually involves a special tribunal by the United Nations. We have here the Special Court for Sierra Leone in 2000 that had the mandate to prosecute persons who bear the greatest responsibility for serious violations of international law and Sierra Leonean law. Two forms of post-conflict reconciliation. Now, what are the pathways to healing? Restorative justice, overcoming inconsistency between justice and reconciliation. So it's a sort of in between blanket amnesty and the criminal justice process. So it's punishment for perpetrators combined or replaced by rehabilitation. Healing, recovery from assault to one's dignity. Substituting subjugation by respectful relationship of human dignity. So again, we have different forms of public processes of bereavement, looking at the Child Bereavement Families Forum, that losing a child in violent conflict is one of the most difficult forms of grief, and how do you overcome that? Because the most vulnerable members of society are being targeted. That's happening in Syria, for example. And the idea during the conflict is we're killing these children in order to break the spirit of that group. But once you have post-conflict societies, how do you overcome from that? Mourning, losses, and remembrance. So we have very public places and sites for public mourning. Latin America, looking at Cambodia. So these are important because it serves as a reference point to acknowledge past atrocities, but it also gives a reference point for moving on. So you create empathy with the other suffering of the other. And you can see how this is a difficult process and certainly a very, very long and painful process. So you can see that really, conflict resolution, we're looking at the invention of peace. Peace is not a natural order to humankind. It's artificial, it's highly volatile, it is not necessarily stable, and a lot of preconditions are necessary how to achieve peace and then how to maintain peace in the long run. The notion is that let's hope that Immanuel Kant's seed of enlightenment will always survive. So again, I mentioned earlier, we live in a much better world today than several decades ago, despite the ongoing conflict and destruction.